So our topic for this episode is the importance of knowing yourself, knowing oneself, and how environment can impact your perception, your thought, and how that can create certain kind of proclivities and predilections and that kind of thing. And this is one of the things that we talk about in our training sessions, right?
Yeah.
The importance of knowing oneself. So let's kick off with that, and why is it so important that we should know ourselves?
Yeah, so if you think about wanting to solve any problem or wanting to achieve any goal that you've set, either as a team or individually, the starting point always is the strengths and weaknesses that you have.
Right.
And what doesn't change between each of the missions that you're on or each of the goals that you're trying to achieve is you. So you're going to be the person that carries through into all the things that you solve or all the goals that you have. So the starting point has got to be yourself. And, you know, it is the case that if we understand our general point of view or our general habits, our biases, that's a big one.
Okay.
And by biases, I mean generally in our thought.
Yeah.
Then we better understand the point that we actually start to solve the problem from. And that's very, very important.
Okay. And what do you think it is that makes us what we are?
Yeah.
You know, what shapes us?
Well, I think traditionally you'd say there was two aspects, one of which is nature, and the other bit which is nurture.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to cover too much in this, John, if it's all right with you. The genetic side, because I think that's probably best done on another occasion,
Yeah.
and we might get some help with that one of somebody of a genuine, I was going to say scientific bent,
Right.
but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But to talk about nurture, and to talk about how certain aspects of your opinions, your biases, the way you look at life, the challenges that you face are a result of the environment that you've grown up in.
Okay. So from your perspective, or our perspective, I guess, how does being English, for example, affect that? You're a white Christian male, as am I.
Yeah.
How does that impact our kind of perception of the world, do you think?
Well, I think the first thing we can do is we can say, well, let's look at something that isn't that, and then let's speculate on how that upbringing may have been different, so may lead to certain different ways of viewing the world. You know, I mentioned before about how people say that travel broadens the mind, and one of the ways it does that, I think, is it allows you to realise that your way of doing it is not the only way of doing it. And that's, I think, quite profound and a good lesson, is that when you grow up in a bubble of your own environment, you think that's everything, you think that's the world. So I grew up in Carlisle, not a particularly big place, but if I'd never been outside there, then maybe I think that the world is Carlisle,
Right.
that everybody thinks like people do in Carlisle in general, that everybody faces the same challenges, and the language of talking about sheep and farming and all that sort of stuff is what everybody's concerned with.
Yeah.
Let's say you go to Saudi Arabia, so somewhere that I spent a few weeks while I was working there. That's a very different environment in most respects.
Yeah. Right.
So you're surrounded by sand. You're not surrounded by green grass and sheep. The environmental experience of the weather, for example, is very different than it is in England. You're talking about summers where it can be 50 degrees sometimes. It's a very different environment, so your experience of the world is different. Then you've got different overlays of thought which might influence you.
Yeah.
So Saudi Arabia is not only Islamic in terms of its general religious thought, but it's also Wahhabist.
Right.
So it's a particular type of Islamic thought.
Okay.
Now, does that mean that everybody is exactly the same in Saudi Arabia? No, it doesn't. But it's important to understand the overlay of the influence upon you.
Okay.
So going back to our example of England, there will be various overlays of almost accepted opinion that you may not even realise are part of your general assumptions.
Right. Okay. How did that, since you brought it up, how did being in the army affect your perceptions of the world? You were in the military for 9 years, was it?
9 years,
9
yeah.
years? How did
Yeah.
that affect your...
So in certain ways, it broadens your experience, undoubtedly. So it makes you realise that when you're in Afghanistan, for example, the first time I ever went to Afghanistan, I went to Kabul and Mazar Sharif at the top. The second time I went was when I was in Helmand. But when I went to Kabul and I went on patrol around the city, I mean, there are people who absolutely live in earth houses. And their general way of life is very, very different than your average person in the UK.
Yeah.
We're so similar as human beings in so many ways, but there are cultural overlays that you and ways that people live, and you think, wow, that's really quite different. And then you start to understand a little bit more about why, in general, people from that environment may have a different slant on life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Through various different reasons. Why they may be, for example, a bit more fatalistic in their approach.
Right.
And various other things. Where they may have a certain robustness and hardiness in the way they live, because we take certain luxuries for granted.
Absolutely.
Compared with how people in Kabul live, for example. So that's one way in which, when you're in the something like the army, it helps you to understand different places. But you could get the same thing from travelling.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you really could.
Yeah.
But the army is interesting because you also see the similarities in people if you're a soldier. So if you're an Afghani soldier, a British soldier, American soldier, Estonian soldier, Swedish soldier, there'll be certain things that connect you because of the necessity of combat and the ideology and the doctrine that goes along with being a soldier. There were many things that when I left the army and went into Civvy Street, I only realised, it's funny, but you realise that you believe certain things because you've been with a group of people who do.
I see.
And yet you think on an individual level that that's your opinion.
Yeah.
For good and maybe for not so good. But when you go and have them challenged by people who maybe not in that environment, don't believe necessarily as you do, don't have the same assumptions, it makes you look at them in a different way and you think, is that actually my opinion that I've arrived at independently?
Yeah, right.
Or is it more because everybody in my environment tends towards that certain viewpoint?
Yeah, you're definitely shaped by the people you spend. Well, what's that? But the saying, you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Big believer in that. I think that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Not just kind of people that you physically spend time with, people that you kind of, whether it's speaking to people on the phone or people that you follow on social media and stuff like that. I think all of those things can completely shape your thought processes and your perceptions of the world and that kind of thing.
Very much.
What was it like? So coming from the army into Civvy Street, and then you came out of the army and you were in the corporate world. You went to pharmaceutical sales, right?
After going back to university for
your degree,
doing a
right?
master's. Yeah.
So what was that like, going from army to
Yeah.
Civvy Street and working in a corporate environment? Was that a
Well, in both cases, you assume when you're in the army, everybody knows the value of what you're doing.
Right.
So there's an assumption that being in the army is valid. Being in the army is a thing of service and duty as well, and therefore is a generally good thing to do. Of course it is, because you're all people who are in the army.
Yeah.
And in your immediate environment, everybody assumes that that's a good thing. And then if you go to, for example, as I did, back to university, you come across university students, university academics, who may have the starting point that the army is not a good thing.
Yeah, right.
And that is a surprise, because I've been 9 years in that incredible, intense environment. And I mean, the training in the army is more intense than anything else that I've experienced in terms of how immersive it is.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you live, sleep, breathe, smoke it.
Yeah.
It's fully in there, which is its power. But then people are like, well, why would you want to be in the army? What do you mean? Because you assume, because you're in the environment.
Of course.
What do you mean? Oh, you baby killers and what? What are you talking about?
Right.
You balloon. What are you on about? And then you can. It's not to then perhaps completely revolve what you used to think, but then you become aware of it as an assumption, and you're not got to be scared of that, because by challenging the assumption, it's probably going to make it stronger in your own mind, but it has more meaning behind it. You understand more why, because you challenge it more, rather than just assuming, oh yeah, well, I've always thought the army's it's a really good thing, but now because you're challenging it, now I have to think why, and better articulate in my own mind why I think it is a good thing.
Okay.
Or in some cases, on some other issues, I completely reverse my opinion.
Right.
From it being challenged by a group of people who thought in a different way. One of the amusing things about the army, you can go to an officer's mess, and they have the newspapers laid out in the anteroom, and you've probably got the Times, and you'll have the Sun.
Right. Okay.
Right? That's probably what you'll have.
All right.
And the argument when you go and read the Sun is always that you're reading it because that's what the lads read, and and everything. I remember the kind of consternation when we found out that one of the Royal Logistics Corps Regiment's officers' mess had the Guardian in it. That was like, they have the Guardian in?
Right.
Who are these pinky lefties, right? And then we thought they were beyond the pale.
Right.
You got the Guardian in, and that's one example of how most people in the army would be geared towards.
Yeah.
Now, that didn't mean that suddenly on leaving I was became paid up socialist. Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
But you do then realise that there is a certain almost body of thought which is typical of for example, army officers.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about religious upbringing? Do you think that has a bearing on how you are shaped? I guess it inevitably has a bearing on how you're shaped when you're young, and you are you're growing up in that environment. But once you've matured and you're an adult, and you've got your own decisions to make and your own choices to make, how much do you think religious upbringing impacts your perception and thought on life?
Yeah, I mean, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on how intense that experience was.
Okay.
So, to list first of all what might be a positive influence, if we think of it like this, is: are you bringing children up with a strong moral framework? Now, of course, you can do that independently of religion.
Yeah.
But if you take, because we're speaking about maybe our upbringings, our environment, a Christian ethic, which can largely be summed up, if you like, in love thy neighbour as thyself.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's the message that you're giving to children when they're being brought up, never mind the other aspects for a minute, then you would at least say that's quite a strong moral framework.
Yeah. Agreed, yeah.
You may also say, I mean, something which we can talk about more broadly is that I think we forget in this country sometimes the influence of Christian morality on our structure. Even though, as you know, in this country now, not a great deal of people go to church, go to Christian church of any kind, Catholic or Protestant or other. But a lot of our framework is based around Christian morality. In particular, I think there's been a huge influence of the idea of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
And that, to me, if you read the Christian story, the New Testament anyway, Old Testament is different kettle of fish altogether.
Right.
And of course, many people who grew up as Christian have a greater influence of the Old Testament, which is not in any way the same. The stories are different, the lessons are different. But if we look particularly at the New Testament, if we are teaching people the story of the Good Samaritan, and narrative form is so important. The idea of that you are raised by stories, by mythology, by ideas is so powerful. And the idea of the Good Samaritan, whether you're completely consciously aware of it or not, has had a huge effect, I think, on the aspirational morality of this country and the West in general. The idea of who is my neighbour, and it's so deep in our kind of collective subconscious that you may not need to know the story completely well, but it will have been a part of your background almost inevitably. And you see that in our approach to charity work as well, I think.
Sure.
Particularly in this country. Again, I'm not saying that you have to have that particular story to do that, but it's certainly been a very big influence on us, I think.
Okay. Parenting. What about parenting? What kind of an influence do your parents have on you growing up? I mean, a huge one, obviously.
Yeah, a huge one. And there are individual conditions here in the way that people are more sensitive than others, I think, to influence. And there comes a time sometimes when they move away from that influence, and for some people, not so much. But it's one of those weird things, I think, with your parents if they're sensible, in that you can go through a period of thinking that they are everything.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go through a counter period when you want to forge your own identity and think what they're saying is rubbish. Then you get older and you realise actually it's quite sensible again. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like if your parents are sensible at all, then you can go through these periods. But certainly your parents are going to have a big effect, I would think, normally, if they're there, on the things that you take for granted, either because you've agreed with them and gone with them, or because you've reacted against them. So it's kind of both in both cases. It may be, of course, that you weren't raised by your parents, but it may be your grandparents had a very big effect on you.
Okay.
And we go back a little bit in time, even to my father's generation. I mean, my father's generation often was brought up by grandparents a bit more, or by extended family members, or when they had very big families, like 10 children, for example, the younger ones were raised by the older children.
Yeah.
And so probably the older children had more direct influence upon them than their parents did.
Yeah.
But that's fine. One of the stories that my father told me about his upbringing in a rural, in Cumbria, in rural part of the world, where it was, what we call old-fashioned now, is that often if a family, bearing in mind this was before, the pill.
Mm-hmm.
So if family had an extra baby that they didn't feel that they can feed, often it was the case that they would pass it over the fence to another family who could.
Crazy, right?
No paperwork, because it was a community, and everybody knew everybody. It was a community, and they would take that child on. The child would still have the surname of he would always know who its biological parents were, but it would be raised by different parents, and that community raising of children, again, that's going to have an impact on you as well, isn't it?
That's crazy, right? I mean, when did that change? How did that change? At what point in
slowly,
time
I think.
things just that kind of
But
community spirit?
What I think, and this is not everything is better in the old days, but I think we do have to acknowledge where things may have had a positive influence and where things don't, and things change and all this kind of business. But what I think is very good about bringing up children in a community is that you will find as a child somebody that you relate more to, and it may not be your parents. Like you know what it is when parents have a child and they're like, where did this dude come from? Because he or she seems very unlike the parents, often more like the grandparents, or more like somebody in the wider community or extended family. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, you can almost choose your role model. Who has a greater influence on you. When we have these kind of more nuclear families, that I think that influence on the kids is then limited to their parents, which isn't always a good thing. Mm-hmm. It can be a good thing, of course, but it's almost like we are two parents, if it's more conventional, and these are our children. Those children don't actually belong to you, though, do they? They're not your property. Mm-hmm. They are, and you get a shock if you think they're your property, because they're going to suddenly surprise you when you find out they got a will of their own.
Yeah, right.
And there's that really, when you see a toddler starting to assert their independence as they get older, and you're like, okay, this is not a servant. This is not a slave. This is an independent person with their own mind, and they're going to turn around and say they don't agree with you.
I mean, do you think it's possible to escape your upbringing, whether you've been brought up in an affluent environment and it just doesn't really sit right with you, and you want to change that, or whether you've been brought up in a less affluent environment and you want to kind of move onwards and upwards? Do you think it's I mean, it's definitely possible, but is it what challenges do you think that brings for people when they are deciding to break the mold, I suppose, of the upbringing that they've had?
Again, it's a question, I think, of how much influence that person can recognise has been had by their upbringing. Okay. So again, it comes back to this idea of knowing yourself, of knowing what parts of your upbringing and the influence upon you directly affect you in the present. If you're fully aware of it, then of course you have then the gift, the choice to be able to go in what direction you want to, and you wouldn't be necessarily limited by your upbringing. Either the examples you gave, limited in one way or limited in another way. You can absolutely break out of it. It takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of reflection, and it takes a lot of conscious awareness of what influences have been had on you. Absolutely. And genetics, I mean, genetics must play a part too, right? And your
your general kind of makeup, how you perceive the world. Well, I think there's definitely something in the genes. I believe we've all got an essence. You know, you do bring some essence from your parents.
I mean, I say we'll probably get into this more in a more sort of technological podcast where we talk about it with somebody who really understands that kind of thing. But I think we can view it in the way that it's pretty obvious that certain people have talents that they come in with, and that those talents can be developed or they can not be developed depending on what environment that person is in. So let's, for example, think of someone like Rafael Nadal. Clearly there is a level of talent there in coordination with a ball, but then he was training from the age of being tiny.
Yeah.
And I think somebody said that when they saw him at 11, he was the best 11-year-old they'd ever seen, for example. You know, here's a guy who could play off both hands and then chose to play left-handed because he thought it would give more problems to opponents. So there's two things there. There's a natural level of talent, but if he'd grown up in a country that doesn't play tennis, he wouldn't have been a tennis player, would he?
Yeah.
Even though he had all the attributes to be a fantastic tennis player. He may well have had the attributes to be a different kind of sportsman, because I understand he's a very good footballer as well.
Right.
And a lot of tennis players are exceptionally good golfers.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can kind of understand that, can't you?
I think a lot of people have just got innate talents. The thing that always springs to mind when I'm thinking about that kind of thing is there's always that kid at school, even when you're really, really young, kind of primary school, there's always that kid that's brilliant at drawing.
Yeah.
And no one's ever taught them how to draw.
No.
No one's ever kind of given them any lessons or anything like that. There's always one kid or a couple of kids or whatever that have got a real talent and aptitude for it.
And what about the kid who's good at doing impressions?
Yeah, the little kind of class comedian.
Again, doesn't get taught. Just observes.
Yeah.
And whatever it is that's in them, in terms of their ability to observe other people and then recreate it, you know, that can start from a very, very early age. I think that ability to imitate.
Yeah.
There's definitely things that you come in with, and it's important. In part of knowing yourself to grasp what they are, you find out when you get challenged, you know, and you need to challenge yourself in many different things in order to find them out. When it comes to the environmental thing that we're kind of talking about now, you need to challenge the assumptions that you have.
Yeah.
And you may find out that they are more of an environmental artifact than have actually come from yourself.
Right, okay.
So if we look at these overlays of culture, and you can say, well, what do we have in the UK? What do we have in England as a kind of a kind of cultural overlay? Well, the general Christian morality is one. It's in the past. And in the present, but I mean, it's a historical fact in the way that the country became. We've got overlays of the Industrial Revolution. We've got overlays of the Enlightenment. We've got overlays of scientific progress, technological progress. All of these things come together. Then we've got really interesting things, and this is kind of where I start to get very, very interested in England and in the UK in general, is in cultural artefacts like, for example, Gothic horror, which is a UK, British thing. And you think, well, why was Gothic horror, in terms of our literature, so prevalent? Frankenstein, you've got Dracula. Okay, Bram Stoker was Irish, but I mean, within the same milieu, and then all these other kind of stories that have been incredibly influential in our modern mythology, tremendously. How many vampire films are there? They feed into so much of our modern fears of the urban environment, and it seems almost that because Britain was the first country to go through the Industrial Revolution, and we're in Manchester. Here we go. Here's the birthplace of it. All the people coming off the land to live in awful conditions in Manchester and London and wherever seemed to produce the kind of conditions that Gothic horror was generated in. So within our kind of consciousness as English people, we have that kind of cultural background, and it may be that is an overlay into our thought and continues to produce in our culture, works with quite a dark kind of menace in them. There's definitely, I think, in our cultural products as British people, a feeling of menace underneath it. You know that I'm a huge fan of the music of Massive Attack. And when I listened to them, and I listened to them when I was abroad as well, when I was overseas, there was something very, very familiar that reminded me of England about it. And that might sound weird because we know how heavily influenced the music of Massive Attack is by West Indian rhythms and by reggae and by dub reggae. But that's absolutely part of our influence in England, and has become part of our influence. But there's a kind of underlying, like, atmospheric menace, slight menace in that, which is, it's hard to explain in words, because if you could explain it in words, you wouldn't need to make music, would you, I guess? It's a feeling you get from the music that seems very, very English to me. And it contains within it our whole dark history as well as our less dark history.
Right.
There's an example of a kind of cultural overlay that I'm talking about, which seems to appear again and again in our cultural works.
And do you think we should be proud to be English?
Well, I mean, I talk about this before, but you don't have to have personal pride in things that you didn't do. If you didn't do it, then it's silly to have personal pride in it. But we are very much products of our environment if we've grown up in England, and if we can understand that English cultural overlay and the certain way that we view the world. We have quite a distinct sense of humour, I think. Many places do, but I think the English one is a very distinct type of humour. Often very surreal, often a kind of clashing together of things, which is unusual and sometimes absurd. There's that within our sense of humour. It's wry and it's sardonic, and we're quite cynical in many, many ways. A kind of cynicism in our cultural products that you don't seem to get to the same extent in American things, for example. But here's the point. I'm not saying that's better or worse. So back to the point about being proud to be English or whatever. There's things that I absolutely love in our cultural heritage that I've been tremendously inspired by, speaking personally. But I didn't do them. So, we have a tremendous history of literature. We don't necessarily have the same impressive history in fine art and painting like they do maybe in Italy, or Spain. I mean, look at the Spanish painters, or the Netherlands. I mean, the word Dutch master is a phrase, isn't it? I mean, there's so many unbelievable Dutch painters that it's kind of embarrassing that their average ones are just unbelievable. We've got who have we got, like Turner, who's maybe impressive on the world stage, but we have other obviously great people. Thomas Lawrence is a portrait painter, Constable, Gainsborough, these kind of people, but they don't quite have the same global impact as some of the Spanish guys and some of the Italian guys, some of the Dutch guys, whatever. But in literature, it seems to be particularly strong, all the way back to Beowulf, Chaucer, and then of course Shakespeare, and then not just Shakespeare, but Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe. You can go on and talk about Jacobean tragedies, and you can go on, and then into the modern era, and you get tremendous history of literature in this country. It's very hard to work out why, but it seems to be that the written word and plays are very, very strong in the English cultural and Scottish and Welsh and Irish cultural experience. So you absorb them. Yeah. Because they are around in our normal sort of the overlay is there wherever you are. It's obviously it's taught in school, but if you're in this country, those things are kind of, we almost think of them as being ours, even though I had nothing to do with the writing of the Shakespeare plays.
Okay, and to wrap it up, if you could give a couple of one or two maybe tips of best ways for people to get to know themselves, what would you suggest? Are there anything any that jump out at you that would be really useful ways to
absolutely
understand who you are?
So one of the things which is a really good thing to do is to take a piece of paper and have 21 boxes in there. And in those 21 boxes, you want to write the most significant events in your life. So let's say you go right back to the very beginning. You pick your first memory. Right. Now, why is it your first memory? Probably because it had a certain kind of impact on you. So that's a very important event for you then. Okay. And if you write down what happened and write down your feelings about it as you remember it in your memory, and then you work through your life and you pick out right from the beginning, the moments that seem the most significant. what happened and what your reactions to them were. And of course, you've got to be completely honest with yourself, and you pick the ones that are painful. You pick the ones that are where you feel pride. You pick the ones, whatever's the most significant. You pick the ones that are embarrassing. They often really stick out, don't they?
Yeah.
Really do. And when you've done 21, going through the whole arc of your life, if you then read them through, you may well find that there is a pattern of how you typically behave.
Interesting.
Or typically react to certain things. And then maybe you can understand how you react in the present.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one that's very obvious to me is that, it's possible without intending to hit a nerve in somebody else. Suddenly you get this overreaction of emotion, and you think, what's happened there?
Yeah.
Or this phenomenon where people say they have a chip on their shoulder. Right, well, what's that come from? Because that's not, just a response to something that's happened in front of you, is it? Or you may have a very strong affection for something, or a very strong liking for something, or attachment to something, or where you were inspired by a certain type of music or artwork or whatever it was. Physicality, whatever it is that you felt, a feeling of joy through, or this will all be in your experiences that you can look back and start to draw a picture.
Right.
And you can say, well, this is going to help me to understand where I am now. It's something which is so powerful because for you, you've probably never done it before. So you've probably got, however old you are in your life, 60 years of age, 70, 50, 40, whatever it is, 20, without having done this.
Yeah.
So, don't be surprised if you pick out some really surprising things.
Yeah.
Because, you may not have examined your life in that way before.
Yeah.
And that's very, very important.
Yeah.
And it's something that you can do, very, very easily if you sit down and actually work it out. It may be a painful experience, I don't know, but then, you be the judge of that when you're doing it.
Yeah, I guess you can have the whole spectrum of emotions, I suppose, if you kind of, trying to think of everything that's gone on that's maybe shaped you and stuff. Those things do tend to, if somebody says, think your most embarrassing moment, most people can pretty much pick that out in 10 seconds sort of thing, or your most kind of happy moment, that kind of thing. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
You may well find, habitual ways in which you react to things.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And those habits can be useful, and sometimes they're not useful. Mm. So, a habit that's not useful is losing your temper whenever somebody hits a certain nerve, or you perceive that they have.
Right.
So, one that's common within some men in particular is when they feel that they're being belittled.
Right.
And you get an overreaction.
Mm-hmm.
And it may well be that they're not, but if they perceive that to be the case, and you might find that out by doing this particular exercise, or you may be somebody who feels that they always have a tragic end to relationships for whatever reason. Okay. But don't worry about that yet. The next stage is then to analyse it a bit more and see how it's affecting you in the present. But the first stage is just to, as honestly as you can, document the significant moments of your life as you remember them, and what your reaction was and what your feelings were.
Excellent.
At that point, you don't have to put any "and this means that" on it at all. Mm-hmm. Just document it completely honestly, and that's really a very good way that you can start off seeing the kind of overlays that you may have of your upbringing, and starting the work of breaking out and then really understanding what you're all about.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, John.